The sun was climbing gently over the rugged peaks of the distant mountains, casting long, golden fingers of light across a landscape that had remained unchanged for generations. In this secluded corner of the world, far removed from the bustling energy of modern cities, lived a man named Jed. He was a soulful, quiet individual, a mountaineer whose weathered hands and kind eyes told a story of hard work, perseverance, and an unwavering devotion to his family. Times were often difficult in the hills, and the soil was stubborn, barely yielding enough to keep his small household fed. Yet, there was an abiding warmth within their modest cabin, a sense of love and mutual support that no amount of poverty could ever diminish. On one particular afternoon, the air was crisp, and the deep green of the forest seemed to shimmer with a quiet promise. Jed walked through the thick brush, his trusted rifle cradled in his arms, his eyes scanning the foliage for any sign of wild game that might provide a hearty supper for his loved ones. He paused near a small clearing, tilting his head as he caught a subtle movement near the base of a great, ancient tree. Raising his instrument with the practiced ease of a seasoned woodsman, he took careful aim at what he believed to be a stray fowl or a rabbit darting through the undergrowth. He pulled the trigger, and the sharp report of the gunfire echoed through the valleys, shattering the afternoon silence. But what followed was not the expected rustle of a successful hunt. Instead, a strange, rhythmic gurgling sound began to emanate from the very earth where his shot had landed. Jed lowered his weapon, his brows furrowing in sheer puzzlement as he stepped closer to investigate. The ground beneath his boots seemed to tremble slightly, and then, with a sudden, soft heave, a thick, dark liquid began to bubble up from the broken soil. It welled up like a strange subterranean spring, rich and viscous, catching the sunlight with a deep, obsidian sheen. Jed knelt down, touching the edge of the pool with a cautious finger. It was oil. In the grand vocabulary of the wider world, it was known as black gold, or perhaps Texas tea, a substance capable of reshaping destinies and altering the course of empires. In a matter of mere moments, though he did not yet fully comprehend the magnitude of the event, old Jed had become a millionaire. The news of this miraculous discovery spread through the valleys like wildfire, carrying on the wind until it reached every corner of the hills. Before long, the entire kinship had gathered at the cabin, their faces bright with excitement and wonder at this sudden stroke of good fortune. The kinfolk looked at the bubbling dark spring, then at Jed, and declared with absolute certainty that he must move away from there. They argued with great passion that a man of his new standing belonged in a place of bright lights and endless possibilities. California, they insisted with wide smiles, was the place he ought to be. With heavy hearts but bright hopes, the family began to prepare for the great journey that lay ahead. They gathered their meager belongings, packing everything they owned into the back of their trusty old truck. It was a slow, deliberate process, but soon the vehicle was loaded to the brim, and with a great roar of the engine, they turned their backs on the mountains and pointed their path toward the legendary hills of Beverly. This was a land they had only heard of in whispers, a place famed for its magnificent swimming pools and dazzling movie stars. It was the beginning of a grand new chapter for the Beverly Hillbillies, a journey filled with laughter, culture clashes, and the enduring strength of a family that refused to forget who they were. When the old truck finally rattled to a halt at the end of a long, winding driveway, the family fell into a stunned silence. Rising up before them was a structure of unimaginable proportions, a sprawling stone edifice with towers and battlements that looked as though it had been transported directly from an ancient storybook. Jethro, a young man of immense physical stature and an equally immense sense of boyish imagination, stared up at the grand building with his mouth agape. He turned to his uncle, his eyes wide as saucers, and remarked that Jed had inherited a veritable mess of a castle. He noted with a grin that it was going to take an incredible amount of mopping just to keep the vast place clean. Granny, the matriarch of the family whose fierce spirit and traditional wisdom were the bedrock of the household, was not easily impressed by stone walls. She looked out over the vast property, her sharp eyes taking in the sheer scale of the grounds, and estimated that there must be at least 10 acres of forest to scrub. Turning to her with a look of deep respect, Jethro declared that she was the royal granny now, and as such, she possessed the grand authority to command the oafs to do all the heavy work. Fired up by the sheer romance of their new surroundings, Jethro struck a dramatic pose, puffing out his chest and declaring that he was now a noble knight. He proclaimed that he must immediately gird his loins and set out into the world to rescue damsels in distress. Ellie Mae, a sweet and gentle young woman with a deep love for all living creatures, clapped her hands in excitement, stating that she wanted to join in the adventure too. But Jed, ever the voice of calm reason and grounded practicality, reminded them all that they were a family, and no matter how grand the house might be, they all needed to pitch in on the daily chores. Jed mentioned that Granny was going to be exceptionally busy using her traditional remedies to doctor their cousin Marcus, who had been feeling quite under the weather. Jethro, however, was still deeply immersed in his fantasy of medieval nobility, warning the family that the castle was likely swarming with Saxon dogs, which he explained was the sophisticated term the ruling class used to describe the servants. Meanwhile, inside the grand estate, a very different kind of preparation was taking place. The sophisticated estate manager, Mr. Faversham, stood in the main hallway, adjusting his jacket with an air of professional anxiety. The telephone on the wall rang, and upon answering it, the gatekeeper informed him that the new American family was currently approaching the main entrance. Mr. Faversham immediately turned to Jenkins, the head of the household staff, and instructed him to have the entire staff line up in the courtyard without a moment's delay. Jenkins nodded crisply, promising to summon them all immediately. Before Jenkins could depart, Mr. Faversham paused, lowering his voice to offer a gentle warning. He reminded the butler that American millionaires were often known to be a bit eccentric, and therefore, the staff must be prepared to indulge their unusual ways with the utmost patience and respect. He emphasized to the gathered servants that they were performing this grand welcoming ceremony for the honor of the Queen, for the pride of their country, and, perhaps most importantly, for the sake of the 6 months of back wages that had been promised to them. Jenkins smiled faintly, assuring him that this argument would provide more than enough motivation for everyone. Back out in the courtyard, the family was still adjusting to the sheer visual impact of their new home. Jed looked up at the massive stone walls, turning to Granny to ask for her honest opinion on the matter. Granny, viewing the world through the practical lens of a mountain homemaker, offered a reassuring nod and suggested that the entire structure would look much better after they had given it a thorough coating of whitewash. Jethro, meanwhile, was entirely focused on the staff of servants standing in a neat line before them. Seeing the estate workers waiting patiently, Jethro turned back to his family and asked if he couldn't get his kin to understand that they no longer needed to perform any manual labor. He explained, with a great deal of pride in his voice, that they now had an assortment of oafs, knaves, and serfs to handle every imaginable task. Jed looked at his nephew, asking if these people really did everything for them. Jethro nodded eagerly, adding that if the workers ever refused, the royal custom dictated that they should simply flog them. Jed's expression darkened slightly at the mention of such harsh treatment. He looked at the young man, his voice steady but firm, and told him to watch that kind of talk immediately. Jethro, defensive but still caught up in his historical fantasies, argued that royal folks in the old stories were always practicing the sport of kings on their workers. He added that if they ever grew tired of such measures, they could simply drag the offenders down to the deep dungeon and pile them up on a grand rack. Jed decided that the boy's imagination had gone entirely too far, raising his hand to declare that it was enough. Hearing the commotion, Mr. Johnson, one of the property representatives, stepped forward with an anxious look, noting that the staff had overheard the dramatic proclamations. Jethro, realizing he had caused a stir, called out to the workers, telling them to come back because he was only having a bit of fun. Mr. Faversham stepped in to handle the situation, offering a polite bow to the family, while Jethro, still trying to sound like a medieval lord, muttered under his breath about sacking dogs to see how quickly they would come to heel under the influence of royal talk. Wishing to understand the roles of the people before him, Jethro stepped up to the line of staff, asking how many of them were officially designated as oafs. He requested that all oafs take one step forward, but the staff remained perfectly still, a few of them exchanging amused glances. Jethro tried again, asking if there were any serfs, knaves, turles, or louds in the crowd, and finally wondering if anyone present was a swineherd. Seeing the lack of response, Jed walked over, asking his nephew if he was having some trouble. Jethro admitted that the workers refused to speak and were merely snickering quietly, suggesting that they might need to send for an official royal person to handle the discipline. At that moment, Mr. Faversham stepped forward with a look of polite bemusement, inquiring about the nature of the conversation. Jethro, perfectly serious, asked how long it had been since these individuals had experienced any discipline, prompting Mr. Faversham to explain that such measures were entirely absent from the modern estate. Jethro turned to his uncle, claiming his theories were proven, while Mr. Faversham introduced himself formally, asking if he was speaking to Mr. Clampett. Jed smiled warmly, introducing himself and his family, extending a hand of genuine hospitality to the sophisticated gentleman. As the introductions continued, a delightful series of linguistic misunderstandings began to unfold. Mr. Faversham explained his role as the major domo of the household, a title that immediately caught Jed's attention. Mistaking the title for a proper name, Jed expressed his pleasure at meeting Mr. Domo, wondering aloud if he should address him as Major instead. Mr. Faversham, maintaining his perfect composure, gently explained that the term domo was simply a traditional reference to the domicile or the household itself. Jed turned to Granny and Ellie Mae, enthusiastically introducing them to their new acquaintance, whom he now referred to as Mr. Domicile. Granny and Ellie Mae offered their warmest greetings, while Jethro noted that since the gentleman was shortening the title to Domo, it seemed only fitting and respectful that the family should call him Major. Finding the arrangement quite acceptable, the gentleman agreed that Major would do nicely. With the introductions complete, Jethro declared that he must get busy with his nightly duties, asking Ellie Mae to accompany him so she could help him secure his heavy metal armor. Before rushing off, he turned back to the Major, asking if there was any official limit on the number of dragons he was allowed to encounter on the property. The Major, displaying a dry wit, assured the young man that he was at perfect liberty to handle as many as he could find, prompting Jethro to declare with a laugh that they would have a grand feast that very evening.